Heroine's Beginning, Chapter 16. The next morning dawned warm and bright. However, I did not find it a particularly good morning, as I woke to discover my courses had arrived. There was a familiar pain in my belly, so I begrudgingly rolled out of bed in search of my rags and herbal tea. As I sat waiting for the kettle on the stove to boil, I began to think of the past year, how every morning I was the first one to awake, the one who made breakfast for everyone, the one who spent her days cooking and cleaning for everyone else. It may have just been the idle thoughts. I was particularly emotional when it came to this time of month. But after I had lost my job working at the manor and Mother died, I had never really considered looking for more work. I just accepted that I was now the woman of the house, and so meant I had to stay home and do the tasks Mother used to do. I knew I shouldn't resent everyone else's freedom, apart from the younger ones. They were still small children, and deserved to go out and play. But Daniel and Clara in particular did not really help out much, and they were definitely of working age. I had enjoyed working in the manor, maybe not the back-breaking scrubbing I used to do, but being around other people who weren't in my family, the conversations we had, the nights we passed playing cards, or in my case reading out loud. Now I was almost doing the same job, but for no pay and very little company. I wanted to get back out there, do something else with my life, not spend it stuck here making soup and dusting every day. The kettle boiled, and I was much soothed by the time I drank the tea. The pain had vanished like it normally did. I went about making breakfast for everyone, again. The routine was exactly the same as yesterday. Clara and Richard slept in, while everyone else took their seats at the table. Father and Alexander left early to go to the field, and then the little ones went out to play. And once again, I was left alone in the house, scrubbing the pots. My dull daily tasks were interrupted by Clara calling me outside around midday. "They're here! The Duke's son and his men! They're actually here!" I placed down the broom that was in my hand and followed her outside to see what the fuss was about. I knew no one in the village stood a chance of owning the slipper. It was Ella's, but I thought it was amusing to watch them try. There was a massive crowd in the market square, mainly composed of young maidens. People were craning their necks to see what was happening. Clara pulled my hand to move around the side of the crowd. "Come on, they're asking for the girls who went to the ball," she said, and pushed me forward. Before I could protest, I found myself in the middle of the clearing, with the crowd surrounding me. I was stood next to Violet, the girl who had arranged the carts to the palace. There were about another 15 or so girls who stood with us, forming a sort of line. "What's going on?" I asked Violet. "They're trying the slipper on every girl who went to the ball. Just imagine, if it fits, Lord Christopher will propose," she said excitedly. Violet had always been one for the melodramatics. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes at this charade. I could save them all a lot of trouble and tell them where Ella was. Why bother continuing with this? One of Lord Christopher's men was stood not very far away, attempting to keep people back, so there was actually space for the girls to stand. I felt I owed it to Ella to try and get them to her as quickly as possible. So I tried and failed to get the man's attention. I coughed. I said, "Excuse me, sir," as loud as I dared. I tried shouting hello, but the loud sounds of the crowd was drowning out my attempts to communicate with him. And the further forward I moved in the line, the further away I got from the man. In the end, I gave up, and decided just to tell the man who was presenting the slipper to each maiden. The closer I got, the more worried I got about Ella. There was definitely more to the story Jacqueline had been telling the night before. I just hoped she was all right. The closer I got to the front, the more anxious I got to tell someone to go find her. The sooner she was out of that house, the happier I would be. My thoughts were interrupted by the girl behind me, Teresa, pushing me forward, and I realized I was at the front of the line. Violet had just finished her turn, and was standing at the front of the crowd, looking a little disappointed. I stepped forward and took a seat on the basic wooden stool that was sat on the floor. I began to unlace my shoe when a familiar voice made me look up. "Well, if it isn't Marion Brown." I found myself staring into the green eyes of Lord James. "Hello again." I smiled. I had not seen him in days. He smiled back, the same smug expression lining his face. "Shall we?" he asked, gesturing to the golden shoe in his hand. "Why, yes, my good sir," I responded. I did not see his face as he looked down to put the shoe on my foot, but I could hear his laughter. As predicted, the slipper did not fit my foot. It was much too small. But when Lord James held it back up, it looked larger, as if it should be able to fit. It was very strange. Lord James helped me to my feet once I had put my shoe back on, and told another man behind him to take his place. He did not let go of my hand as we moved to the edge of the crowd. "So this is where you live. I shall keep that in mind," he said. His teasing nature had not changed. "Please don't use it against me," I told him. "You know, it's not very far from my manor. Maybe the odd fly-in visit could arise." "I would not. My father and brother have far too many questions to ask you." "You never said you had a brother," he admitted. "I do not," I said. It was technically true. "But you just said you did," he asked, confused. "I have 5. "Oh my, you have an entire army to defend your honor." "I think Robbie is a little small to be doing that. He's only 7. 7 years old. That's when they're the fiercest," he joked. I laughed a little. Trying to imagine Robbie fighting James was rather amusing. When I stopped laughing, I remembered my resolve on meeting a person on this mission to find Ella. "How long have you been searching?" I asked. "A few days. We've been nearly everywhere. The men are getting more and more exhausted and disheartened," he said, with a serious tone in his voice. "We haven't gotten much sleep, as you can probably tell." I looked at his face, and he did indeed have prominent bags under his eyes. "But Christopher is determined to find her, and what is a friend to do in this situation, apart from follow him blindly?" "Have you checked the manor house just up the path?" I asked, anxious of the response. "Yes, we have. We've just come from there. 2 maidens, one with stupid hair, and the other looked a little like a servant, although her dress was finely made. Why do you ask?" He looked at me questioningly. "Did you say 2 maidens?" I asked. "Only 2?" "Yes, there were only 2, he responded. My anger grew. If there were only 2 maidens, that meant that Ella was being kept out of sight, most likely locked in a room somewhere. Suddenly seeing Jacqueline in dirty clothes made sense. Ella had been locked away since the day of the ball, and it was left to the only half-competent person in the house, Jacqueline, to do everything. Ella had said she was much nicer than her family. She frequently helped Ella, so I'm sure Ella had taught her a few things while she was down there. Ella had been locked away for attending the ball. How cruel could Lady Kensington be? I stared at James. "There should have been 3. There should have been 3 girls in that house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What?" James asked. "What do you mean?" "There are 3 maidens living in the manor, 2 sisters and their stepsister, who has been treated wrongly by her stepfamily. She is the girl you're looking for," I told him. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he held out his hand and said, "Come, you must tell Christopher." I took his hand. It felt familiar. "You, my good lady, may have just saved me another night's sleep in a barn, and for that I am eternally in your debt if what you say is true," he told me excitedly as we made our way through the crowd of people who were still watching the girls trying and failing to fit the slipper. We burst through the far side of the crowd and were confronted by several horses and a face I now recognized as Lord Christopher. I sank into a curtsy almost instinctively, while James began speaking to his friend. "This is Marion. I met her at the ball. She knows where your golden princess is," he said, smiling at me. I rose from my curtsy and was greeted by Lord Christopher standing in front of me, with a hopeful expression on his face. "Truly, do you know where she is?" he asked. He could not contain his excitement. "Yes, she lives in the manor house," I said. His face fell quite considerably. He clearly did not believe me. "No, she does not. We just visited there, and neither of those girls were her," he told me. "She does live there. There should have been 3 girls trying on the slipper, not 2, I replied. "She lives with her stepfamily, the ones who currently own the house. Well, if living is what you can call it. They have made her life a misery, and more than likely she has been locked out of sight to try to keep her away from you. Her stepmother is a very cruel woman." Lord Christopher listened to my speech, but did not look completely convinced. "If you don't believe me, go back to the manor. Look behind every locked door, the servants' quarters, the hidden passages. I promise you will find her there," I cried. "How do you know this?" he asked me. "I used to be a servant there myself. I know how cruel that woman is, and I know the manor." Lord Christopher looked at James. "Do you trust her?" he asked. James looked back at me, a smile gracing his lips, but this time not one of arrogance, but one of genuine happiness. Yes, I do," he said, still looking at me. Lord Christopher nodded and turned around to climb on top of his horse. James followed suit. Lord Christopher shouted to the other men to get to their horses. They were leaving. "Would you show us?" he asked me. I nodded back to him. "I'm afraid we don't have a spare horse. Would you care to ride with James?" Lord Christopher inquired. "I don't mind," I said, as James lowered his hand down and I grasped it. I had never been on top of a horse before, so I was a little anxious. James pulled me up, and I swung my leg over the back of the horse, perching myself on top. "Hold on, I like to ride fast," James said. "Where?" I shouted at him as the horse began to move. He stopped for a moment and then reached backwards for my hands. I placed them in his, and he moved them around to his front, so they were tightly holding on to him. It felt strangely intimate, holding on to someone like this, from behind and so tightly. But as the horse took off, I paid no attention to that, only how to stay on without falling off and killing myself. James was right. He did like to go fast. Lord Christopher was slightly ahead of us, and the rest of the men, around 5 in total, trailed behind us. The wind whipped deliciously in my hair, making it fall out of the braids slightly. My cheeks colored, and my lungs breathed in the truly fresh air. I had never had this feeling of riding a horse before, and it was glorious. Even though I had been this route many times, I had never experienced it quite like this. The journey normally took about 20 minutes, 15 if you ran. On horseback, we made it in 5. The gray stones of the manor house came into view, and we slowed. Once we got to the courtyard, Lord Christopher did not even wait for his horse to stop. He swung his leg over the back of the horse and strode up the front steps to the door. With his hand curled tightly into a fist, he hit the door rapidly many times, while shouting for someone to open the door. Myself and James were not quite as urgent. The horse came to a halt before either of us made a move to get down. James moved first, gracefully jumping off the horse. I remained a little longer, sat on that beautiful chestnut-colored stallion. At the moment, my list of things to do if I ever suddenly became wealthy was growing. I wanted to learn how to ride a horse, along with owning a small library. My hair was now completely falling out of the braid I had put it in, and so I pulled the green ribbon out of the end of it, letting my hair fall freely down my back, slightly curled as it had stayed in the braid for so long. I shook it a little, trying to get it all undone. I turned my head to look at James, hoping he knew how to get me down off the horse. He was staring at me, his eyes wide. The smile that he usually wore wiped off his face without a trace. His mouth was slightly agape, and his face held an expression I did not quite know. It puzzled me. I waited another moment and then spoke. "Can you help me down, please?" I asked. He shook his head slightly, as if waking himself from a daze, and lifted his arms into the air. They circled my waist, and he tightened his grip slightly as I pushed myself off the horse, not quite as gracefully as he did, into his waiting arms. I expected to hit the ground immediately, but it was several more seconds before my feet touched earth. He lowered me slowly, as if I were a precious, fragile object that must be handled with care. When I did reach the ground, he released his grip on me, and our attention was drawn by the loud opening of the front door of the manor. Lady Kingston stood before us, her sickly sweet smile plastered on her face. "My lord, have you returned to claim my daughter?" she asked politely. Just then she must have seen me, as her eyes narrowed and her smile vanished from her face. "No, I'm here seeking another lady, one that you have concealed," Lord Christopher told her, his voice only betraying a little anger. "Well," she said, staring at me. "I'm sorry to tell you, but your information is incorrect," Lady Kingston replied. "Would you mind if we took a look around, just to be clear?" he said, with a tone that implied that no was not an answer. "There is really no one else here, my lord." "She," Lady Kingston said, pointing directly at me, "is a liar and a wicked child." I stood my ground, staring straight back at her, not moving a muscle. "Now, my lord, it's been a trying day for all of us, and we really are very busy. I have matters to attend to." Lord Christopher looked downhearted. He was clearly too polite to simply burst in and demand to look around, as was his right as lord. He outranked Lady Kingston quite considerably. I, on the other hand, was definitely not too polite, and I could not care less what Lady Evil thought. She was not going to do this to Ella, not again. I stormed right past James, and up the steps, passing Lord Christopher, who looked on in shock. I walked right up to Lady Kensington, who threw out her arm to stop me from entering. "Last time you were here," she snarled, "I forbade you from entering my house again." "Well, it's lucky, then. This is not your house. It should rightfully be Ella's. You never deserved it," I told her. "And another thing, I don't care." With that, I ducked as quickly as I could and ran under her arm, straight into the entrance hall of the house. I ran as fast as I could toward the servants' door that was hidden just off to the left of the staircase. Lady Kensington's fashionable dress must have slowed her down, as she did not catch up to me. I ran down the corridor and began shouting for Ella. I could hear male voices behind me, and knew that Lord Christopher, James, and the other men must have taken the lead and just walked right past Lady Kensington. What I would have given to see the look on her face at that moment. I ended up in the kitchen and found Jacqueline standing in front of the stove, stirring what looked like stew. She was clearly surprised to see me, but didn't say anything, as just then 7 men burst through the door behind me, Lord Christopher and James amongst them. "Jacqueline, where is she?" I pleaded. "Please tell me." She opened her mouth to speak, but just then Lady Evil and Lady Idiot came through the door. "Jacqueline, dear, I think you should tell our guests that there is no one here, just the 3 of us," Lady Kensington cooed. "Yes, only the 3 of us," Lady Anna repeated. "Jacqueline, please, she needs you," I told her in a quieter voice. "This is wrong, you know it." There was silence for a moment, which was surprising, seeing as though there were 11 people in a kitchen that was meant to hold 6. Jacqueline opened her mouth, her head down, and I knew she was going to say what her mother wanted her to say. I worked out a long time ago that she had no confidence in herself at all. That's why she hid her face so often, and why she was the one down here cooking for her family. "Jacqueline, you know this is wrong. Do it for her. She would do it for you," I said to her, begging with my eyes. She looked at me and started to smile. In a very quiet voice that I'm sure only I could hear, she whispered, "You're right, she would." Then something rather miraculous happened. She lifted her head, straightened her spine, and took a deep breath. "No, Mother," she said in a very loud voice. "There are not only 3 of us here. Ella is here too. You locked her in that horrid attic." And with that, she slipped a small key into my hand, as some of the men turned around and began to make their way out of the door. Lord Christopher ordered that 2 men stay behind and watch over Lady Kingston and Lady Anna. Once I had the key in my hand, I smiled and nodded at Jacqueline quickly. Then I ran from the room, Lord Christopher and James following close behind me. I knew exactly where the attic was. I had gotten lost there my first day and accidentally opened the door that led up there. Over the years, I'd found my way around the house easier, and the passage to the attic became a regular trip, mainly because it also led to the library. We made our way along the corridor as quickly as we could in the near dark. There were a few candlesticks on the hall, but none of them were lit, so we had to rely on light coming in from under doors to guide us. I did not trip or stumble. I had done this 100 times in the dark. We at last reached the large wooden door, and I fumbled with the key, trying to get it into the lock. When it turned at last, I pushed it open, and was once again greeted with a cold gust of wind. The stairs were still as large and windy as I remembered. We all raced up them, Lord Christopher taking them 2 at a time, until we reached the top, and I was slightly out of breath. There was another door that greeted us there, and I passed Lord Christopher the key as he was in front of me. But it did not fit. He tried to get it to work for several more seconds, until James noticed a smaller key hanging on a hook on the wall. He pulled it off and handed it to his friend, who fitted inside the keyhole and turned the handle. He pushed open the door, and an empty room greeted us. It was small, and there was nothing in it. No bed, no blanket, no sign that anyone had used this room recently. The floorboards looked old and rotting, and only a very small window let in some light. He walked through the room, looking around. James and I followed. We were exceedingly puzzled for a moment, until I walked past the place where the door ended, and a loud cry came from behind the door. I spun quickly and saw Ella, with a water pitcher raised above her head, as if she were ready to strike me. She stopped moving, and recognition spread over her face. She quickly threw the pitcher down to the side and moved to embrace me tightly. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, and she looked thin. She had always been thin, but she almost looked skeletal. "Marion, it's you!" she cried. I could feel her tears falling onto my shoulders. I embraced her just as tightly as she did me. I guessed her eyes were closed, or she was looking down, as she had clearly not spotted Lord Christopher. "I'm sorry I nearly hit you. I thought it was them. I heard a lot of footsteps, and I thought they were coming." She choked back a sob. I slowly lessened the pressure of my hug, and I brought her head up to face me. She was wiping away her tears. She instantly froze, and I followed her eye line over my shoulder. "I've brought someone here to see you," I told her. I smiled, but I knew she wasn't looking at me. I stepped back and went to join James on the far side of the room. Lord Christopher and Ella stared at each other, Ella in shock, Christopher in awe. "I do believe that I asked to see every girl who attended the ball," he told her. His voice had softened. "I do not think you've tried this slipper yet." He glanced down at her feet and saw she already wore no shoes beneath her tattered blue cotton dress. He knelt before her and opened the bag he had tied around his wrist. The golden slipper was brought out and held in front of Ella. She slowly lifted her foot toward the shoe, and it slid inside easily. A perfect fit. Lord Christopher sighed audibly, and more tears ran down Ella's face. But this time, a wide smile lit up her entire being. As Lord Christopher began to stand up, I felt James reach for my hand and pull me toward the door. I followed him without question, knowing that they would probably want some privacy. I walked out of the small room, closing the door on what I imagined was a truly magical moment. I felt myself breathe at last. It had been a very unusual day.